Yep.
Great. So now we have our second IPv6 talk. Philip is a senior research scientist at Akamai. He's busy crunching Akamai's data, primarily to study and defend against security threats. I'm happy to hear that he says he still loves measurement, and IMC remains his favorite conference. And I think if you look at his publication record, you'll see that the feeling is mutual.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the kind introduction. Okay, so this talk is about detecting large-scale IPv6 scanning. So I want to start off by quickly clarifying what we mean actually by scanning. So scanning means that we have a scan source, and that scan source sends probing packets to a large number of hosts on the internet. And these probing packets test if the targeted host runs a specific service that the scanner is interested in. Okay, in this case, the scanner is interested in hosts that run telnet, so it sends TCP SYN packets on port 23. And of course, it doesn't just send a single packet, but it sends these packets to as many hosts as possible, and that's also why it's called scanning, right? And after doing this, eventually a host will get back to the scanner, in this case with a TCP SYN-ACK, and then what typically happens next is typically something malicious, so the scanner may either try to exploit vulnerabilities in the target host or leverage it as an amplifier, as a reflector in amplification attacks, and there are many more scenarios possible. So one thing is clear, that scanning is really a key component for many of the cyber attacks that we are actually dealing with. Now, most of what you read about scanning, both in the academic literature as well as in the operations community, concerns scanning in the IPv4 space. And scanning the v4 space is something that's relatively easy to do, right? So we only deal with about 4 billion targets. Only about 3 billion of them are routable, and you can kind of relatively easily scan the entire IPv4 space in less than 1 hour. So this is the scanning part. Also, when it comes to detecting who is scanning the other space, we can readily do that in the IPv4 space if we monitor traffic on otherwise unused prefixes, so-called darknets. There are some limitations to that, but to get an overall sense, that's readily available for the IPv4 space, and there's a lot of that scanning happening, right? So we have in the v4 space millions of active scanning sources every month. Now, if you look at the v6 space, everything gets like vastly more complicated. So we have about 10 to the power of 38 target addresses. And if you wanted to scan all of them, it will literally take trillions of years, so it's just not practical. And so if someone wants to scan the v6 space, they need to rely on hit lists, like the one that we just learned about, for example, so they cannot just randomly send out probing packets. Now, given the fact that scanners need to specifically target individual addresses and individual hosts, that also makes the detection of what is actually happening in the IPv6 internet in terms of scanning really difficult, because now we need a vantage point that actually attracts scanning traffic itself that we can then study. And maybe not surprisingly, as a result of that, the current extent of who is scanning and what are they scanning for in the IPv6 space is largely unknown. So, and that's the key question here. So what is going on in the IPv6 space? And to shed some light into who is actually scanning, we present a first longitudinal study of what we call large-scale IPv6 scanning in the internet. And the primary data source that we use is 15 months of firewall logs that were collected from hundreds of thousands of CDN edge machines. So essentially, every packet going to these machines that is not TCP 80 or 443, it's not web, essentially, will get logged by this firewall. So this is the primary data set. We also double-check some of the most salient findings with what can be observed in publicly available data sets, and more specifically, the MAUI trace, which monitors traffic on a transit link and is available to the research community. Now, I want to very briefly highlight why our two vantage points are capable of highlighting, of seeing IPv6 scanning traffic. Now, I guess for the CDN, the situation is relatively clear. So the front-facing IP addresses of our caches, of our machines, are exposed, right? They are exposed by a DNS, and then we engage in like myriad transactions with millions of hosts on the internet. So they end up, for example, on IPv6 hit lists, and then scanners can target them. And now for the MAUI trace, MAUI really just monitors traffic on the wire. And if there happens to be someone scanning, and if that scanning traffic happens to cross that particular link, it will of course be visible in this data set as well. Okay, so, and what we're interested in is what we call large-scale IPv6 scans. And in essence, what we require is that for something to be considered a scanner, scan source needs to target at least 100 destination IPs in short order. I mean, of course, we do more filtering. You can read more about that in the paper, but that is the essence of our scan detection. Okay, now let's have a look at how much scanning is actually going on. So in this plot here, I show you for our entire measurement window, I show you the number of weekly active scanning sources that we detected, in this case at the CDN data set, using our scan detection mechanism. And so here the big takeaway is like IPv6 is being actively scanned as of now. Now let's be clear, I mean, the number of active sources, that's really nothing compared to what's happening in the IPv4 space. So that's really many orders of magnitude fewer scanning sources, but key thing is it is actively being scanned. Now the question, of course, is like who is scanning, and for that I want to show you this table here. So this table shows the top 20 source ASs from which we detect scanning traffic, and here we just order them by kind of scan packets that we see. And we can make a couple of observations when looking at this table, and I guess the first one is that what we see is heavily concentrated among a very small number of highly active ASs. So the top 10 ASs account for more than 99% of all the scanning in terms of packets. And if we look at the network types, like the business types of these networks, I mean, we can find that the majority of these networks are either cloud providers, where you have like the respective resources in terms of machines and bandwidth readily available. And we also find several cybersecurity companies actively starting to scan the IPv6 space. Now, speaking of sources, and then so we have the cloud providers, and we have some cybersecurity companies, and then we have these two highly active ASs on the very top that geographically map to China, and that we are not able to associate them with any major cloud provider, and they really account for a huge chunk of the scanning traffic that we see. And amazingly, or the very most active source, so that very first one that accounts for 40% of the scan traffic that we see at the CDN, is also the single most active source that we see actively scanning in the MAUI data set. And this particular source has been active for almost 2 years, and it is still scanning as of right now. And so it's the most active scanner in both of our vantage points. And in addition to that, it was reported thousands of times in publicly available data sets. And I'm just screenshotting one of them here. So this is public data. And so yes, this is the very most active source, and we don't really know who or what is behind this. So if anybody has any ideas on that, we would love to learn about it. Okay, so coming back, one quick note about the ports and the services being targeted. So this is a short slide because there's not that much to say. What we find is that the majority of scans that we see, they target multiple port numbers. So they target multiple services. So if you want to interpret this kind of looks more like general penetration testing behavior as opposed to what we see more in the IPv4 space, specific exploitation attempts of individual vulnerabilities. Okay, now coming back to this table, so you may have noticed that both in this table as well as in the figure earlier, when looking at the actual scan sources, we show like 3 different columns. And the first one is the number of scanning sources that we see in terms of like source 128-bit full IPv6 addresses, and the other column is how many sources we see if we first aggregate all the traffic from the same /64 prefix together, and then apply our scan methodology, as well as with first aggregating to a level of /48 prefix. And you can see that the numbers like vastly different, right, for these different aggregation levels. And what this hints at is a major challenge that we stumbled upon when actually executing this work. And this challenge is really identifying and isolating individual scan sources. And I want to show by example what I mean here. Now, the numbers here, they're fiction. They're kind of made up, but I want to highlight we have very similar cases in our actual data set. Now, let's consider this example. We have a cybersecurity company, and they announce an entire /32 prefix in BGP. And from what we see is that the scanner behind this prefix leverages the entire address space of this entire /32 prefix to source the scan probes. Okay? So every individual source address here will at most send us one single packet that belongs to the scan. Okay? And the problem is that it's not easy to detect this to be a scanner, right? Because you may just see one single packet. So in order to pinpoint and to correctly detect this scanning entity, we have to aggregate all the traffic up to an entire /32 prefix. Now we could say, okay, then let's just do that. But of course, that doesn't really work because for this scanner, a /32 mask is the correct aggregation. But we see a bunch of other scanners, for example, from major cloud providers. There's actually such a case. They announce also a /32 in BGP, but the internal distribution of the address space is totally different. And in fact, an individual user, an individual VM inside this cloud provider only has a /124 assigned. So if we were to aggregate everything together, we would essentially aggregate the entire cloud provider together. And if we were to use that in an operational setting, we would, of course, cause a lot of collateral damage, right, when blocking traffic, for example, from this prefix. So this is one of the key challenges we face, that we don't yet have a great solution to that. And yeah, so just repeating that quickly. So without aggregation, we may miss some or sometimes all of the scanning packets. We may just not detect it. But with too much aggregation, we may conflate individual scanners and cause collateral damage when we use that. Okay, and I think, yeah, and with that, I'm already about to conclude. So the key finding, yes, the IPv6 space is right now actively being scanned, so people have started scanning it. The detection is challenging for various reasons, as we highlighted in the paper. And of course, I hope that I could get you interested in this. We have many more details about the vantage points, the detection methodology, and also more details on the services targeted and addresses targeted in our paper. And with that, I conclude, and I'm looking forward to your questions.